I'd bought the nun just to use her body, but the mountain man fell for her heart. Daniel Carter lived high in the mountains, far away from towns, crowds, and noise. His cabin stood alone among tall pine trees where the wind often spoke louder than people. Most days the only sounds he heard were the crackling of firewood, the rustling of leaves, and the distant call of wild birds. It was a hard place to live, especially in winter. But Daniel had chosen this life. He believed the mountains were simpler than people. Years earlier, Daniel had not been this quiet or distant. He once lived in a small town with his wife and young son. His life had been ordinary but full of warmth. He worked hard, came home every evening, and spent time with his family. He had plans, hopes, and reasons to smile. But one terrible accident changed everything. In a single day, he lost the two people he loved most. After that loss, something inside him broke. The world felt empty, and every familiar place reminded him of what was gone. He stopped visiting friends. He stopped talking about his feelings. He stopped believing that life could ever feel normal again. Eventually, he sold his home, packed his tools, and moved into the mountains, where no one asked questions and no one expected him to be happy. Life there was not easy, but Daniel did not mind the hardship. Hard work kept his mind busy. Each day he followed the same routine. He woke up early, chopped wood, checked his supplies, and walked long distances to trade goods with small settlements nearby. Sometimes he bought livestock, sometimes tools, and sometimes he helped transport items for people who could not make the journey themselves. He was known as reliable and honest, but also quiet and distant. Most people respected him, but very few knew him. Daniel spoke only when necessary. He did not enjoy long conversations or friendly gatherings. To him, emotions were heavy things, and he had carried enough weight already. The mountains had taught him to depend only on himself. If something broke, he fixed it. If supplies ran low, he found a way to get more. If the winters were harsh, he endured them without complaint. Over time, his cabin became a place built for survival, not comfort. The floors were rough, the kitchen was simple. Meals were basic and often the same every day. He cleaned only when it was necessary. There were no decorations, no personal items, and no signs that anyone else had ever lived there. It was a quiet, practical life, and that was exactly how he wanted it. One winter evening, while returning from a trading trip, Daniel stopped at a small mountain settlement to rest and warm himself. The settlement was little more than a few wooden buildings, a store, and a shelter where travelers sometimes stayed. Snow had begun to fall, and the air was growing colder. He planned to stay only long enough to eat and continue his journey in the morning. Inside the small store, he overheard a conversation between the shop owner and an older woman. They were speaking in worried voices about a young woman who had nowhere to go. At first, Daniel paid no attention. Other people's problems were not his concern. But when the shop owner mentioned that the local convent had closed and its residents had been sent away, Daniel looked up. The young woman's name was Maria. She had spent most of her adult life living quietly in the convent, helping with daily work, caring for visitors, and serving the community. When the convent lost its funding and closed, she suddenly found herself without a home, without income, and without family to turn to. The older woman explained that Maria had been staying temporarily in a small room behind the store, but it could not continue for long. Winter was coming fast, and the settlement had limited resources. They were trying to find someone who could give her work and a place to stay. Daniel listened silently. He was not moved by emotion, but he understood something very practical. Winters in the mountains were long and difficult. His cabin required constant work, cooking, cleaning, carrying water, preparing food, and maintaining supplies. Doing everything alone took time and energy. To him, the situation sounded like a simple arrangement. She needed shelter and work. He needed help managing the cabin. It was not kindness that guided his thinking. It was practicality. After a moment, he asked a few short questions. Could she cook? Could she handle hard work? Was she healthy enough for mountain life? The shop owner seemed surprised, but answered honestly. Maria was quiet, hard-working, and used to simple living. That evening, Daniel agreed to meet her. Maria entered the small room slowly, holding a worn cloth bag that contained all her belongings. She was young, but looked tired from uncertainty and recent hardship. Her clothes were plain, and her expression was calm but cautious. She did not speak much, but her eyes showed both nervousness and quiet strength. Daniel explained the arrangement clearly. The work would be hard. The cabin was far from town. Winters were severe. In return, she would have a place to stay, food and payment for her work. He spoke in a straightforward tone, without warmth, but also without harshness. Maria listened carefully. She asked only one question, whether she would be treated with respect. Daniel answered simply that he expected work and honesty, nothing more. After a brief moment of thought, she agreed. For Maria, the decision was not easy, but it was necessary. She had no family nearby, and no stable place to go. The mountains were unfamiliar, and the man standing before her was a stranger, but he did not seem cruel or dishonest. He seemed distant, but reliable. The next morning, before sunrise, they began the journey to the mountains. The road was long and mostly silent. Snow covered the ground, and the cold wind moved through the trees. Daniel walked ahead, carrying supplies, while Maria followed quietly behind, holding her small bag close. She did not complain, even when the path became steep or the cold grew stronger. After several hours, the cabin finally appeared between the tall trees. It was simple, strong, and built for survival rather than comfort. Smoke rose from the chimney, and wood was stacked neatly along the wall. Daniel opened the door and showed her inside. The space was clean enough but plain. There was a small kitchen area, a table, a bed in the corner for him, and a smaller room where she could stay. He explained where the supplies were kept and what needed to be done each day. Maria nodded and began her work almost immediately. Daniel watched quietly for a moment before stepping outside to continue his tasks. To him, the arrangement had begun exactly as planned. He had brought someone to help manage the work of the cabin. But as the cold wind moved through the trees and the door closed behind him, neither of them knew that this simple, practical decision would slowly change the direction of both their lives in ways neither of them expected. Life in the cabin was very different from anything Maria had ever experienced. At the convent, she had lived in a community surrounded by people, rules, and routine. Every day was planned, prayers at certain times, chores assigned, and guidance from the elders. The work was sometimes tiring, but it had structure and comfort. Here in the mountains, however, everything was raw and unpredictable. The wind whistled through the trees, the snow piled high in winter, and the nights were dark and long. The cabin was quiet except for the sound of fire crackling in the stove or the occasional animal moving outside. Daniel spoke very little. He had his own ways of doing things, and he did not like others interfering. He gave clear instructions, but did not explain much beyond that. Maria learned quickly that if she wanted to live comfortably here, she would have to pay attention and adapt. She washed dishes, chopped firewood, cleaned the floors, and prepared meals for the two of them. She woke up early to fetch water from the nearby stream before the ice grew too thick, and helped Daniel carry supplies from the store whenever he made the trip down the mountain. At first, Daniel watched her work in silence. He did not offer praise or gratitude, That was not his way. He expected her to do her tasks properly, and she did. Maria worked quietly, never complaining, even when her hands were sore from chopping wood or her feet ached from walking through the snow. Her patience and carefulness impressed Daniel more than he cared to admit. Though he tried to stay indifferent, he noticed small things about her: how she arranged the firewood neatly, how she cleaned the windows even when he did not ask, how she always made sure the food was ready before he returned from the mountains. Evenings were the hardest. After long days of work outside, Daniel would sit by the fire and stare into the flames. He rarely spoke. Maria, on the other hand, sometimes hummed quietly as she worked in the kitchen or arranged the small cabin. It was a soft sound, almost like a song, and it made the cabin feel warmer and less empty. Daniel tried to ignore it at first, thinking it was silly or unnecessary. But slowly the sound became something he looked forward to in his quiet, lonely nights. Winter was approaching, and the snow began to fall more heavily. Traveling became dangerous, and they had to rely on supplies stored in the cabin. Daniel went down to the store less often, and Maria had to manage more tasks on her own. She learned how to cook efficiently with the limited ingredients they had. She even started preserving food for the winter, learning to dry herbs and vegetables and store them in jars. Daniel watched her silently as she worked, sometimes studying her without speaking. He did not understand why he felt a little lighter inside when he saw her caring for the cabin. Despite their quiet coexistence, there were moments when they began to connect. One evening, after a long day of fetching firewood, Daniel injured his leg slipping on an icy trail outside. He tried to walk back to the cabin, but the pain was sharp, and he realized he could not manage alone. Maria noticed when he limped in through the door, and without hesitation, she helped him inside, set him near the stove, and fetched water to clean the wound. She carefully bandaged it and made him sit with his leg elevated while she prepared warm tea. Daniel was not used to receiving help. He had spent years doing everything himself, and accepting assistance felt strange. "Why are you helping me so much?" he asked, his voice rough from both pain and confusion. Maria simply replied, "Because no one should be alone when they are hurt." That simple sentence, spoken with calm sincerity, made him feel something he had not felt in years. It was not physical attraction, nor was it obligation. It was the recognition of kindness, honesty, and care. Days passed, and the injury forced Daniel to stay inside more. During this time, Maria continued her quiet routines, but also took care of him. She cooked meals, cleaned the cabin, and kept the fire going. In return, Daniel began to talk a little more. He shared small details about the mountain trails, the animals he had seen, and the challenges of surviving in such harsh conditions. Maria listened carefully and asked gentle questions, showing interest without judgment. Her presence made the cabin feel less like a place for survival and more like a home, even though Daniel resisted admitting it. One day, a traveler arrived at the cabin, exhausted and hungry. Daniel would have turned him away, following his usual practical thinking that strangers were a burden. But Maria stepped forward. She offered him food and water without asking for anything in return, insisting he rest before continuing his journey. Daniel observed her quietly, a part of him resisting and another part feeling a strange warmth he could not explain. He had spent years closing his heart to the world, believing kindness was weakness, yet here, in this small cabin, he was seeing strength in compassion. Over time, the mountain man and the young woman started to share small routines together. Maria would prepare breakfast before Daniel left for trading or hunting, and he would find notes or reminders she left for him when he returned. Sometimes she would set the fire to burn a little longer so the cabin would be warm when he came in. These were small gestures, almost invisible to an outsider, but they carried meaning. Daniel began to notice that he was waiting for her to finish tasks, for the smell of food, for the warmth of the fire, small signs of life and care that made the harsh mountains feel less lonely. Maria, in her quiet way, began to learn about Daniel too. She saw the pain in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, and the careful way he approached every task. She realized that he had experienced deep loss, and she did not judge him for it. She simply accepted him as he was, showing that support and patience could exist without forcing change. She never asked him to speak about his past, but when he chose to share small details, she listened with attention and empathy. Their days became predictable in the best way. They rose with the sun, worked hard, shared simple meals, and ended the day by the fire. Yet this predictability allowed trust to grow slowly. Daniel, who had once been so guarded, began to rely on Maria for more than work. Her presence gave him comfort. Her careful attention made him feel less isolated. Her calm demeanor reminded him of a world where people could care for one another without expectation. One particularly harsh night, a snowstorm trapped them inside the cabin. The wind howled and the cold pressed against the walls. Daniel and Maria worked together to keep the fire going and to ensure the supplies would last. They spoke little, but the shared effort created a quiet understanding between them. Daniel realized, for the first time in many years, that he could trust someone completely. He could rely on her presence, her actions, and her heart. By the end of the winter, their connection was undeniable, even if unspoken. Daniel no longer thought of Maria as simply a helper. He began to recognize her as a person of strength, patience, and warmth. Maria, too, saw Daniel differently. Beneath his rough exterior and quiet demeanor was a man who had been hurt deeply, but who had the capacity for kindness and protection. The cabin, once just a place to survive, had become a space where trust, understanding, and subtle affection could grow. Though neither of them spoke about it openly, the mountain man and the young woman began to change. The routine tasks, the long hours of work, and the harsh environment had brought them closer, not through dramatic events, but through quiet acts of care, observation, and shared hardship. Every meal prepared, every fire tended, and every word spoken carried meaning. They were learning to rely on each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. By the time the snow melted slightly and the first signs of spring appeared, Daniel could no longer imagine life in the cabin without Maria. And Maria, who had come to the mountains out of necessity, found herself wanting to stay not just for safety or shelter, but for the man who had started as a stranger and had become someone she could trust with her heart. The mountain cabin had started as a place of work and survival, but through the quiet dedication of a young woman and the slow awakening of a guarded man, it had become the beginning of a connection neither of them had expected, but both of them had needed. As winter slowly faded and the first signs of spring began to show, life in the cabin continued its quiet rhythm, but something inside Daniel was beginning to change. He had always been practical, focused only on survival, work, and routines, but he could no longer ignore the warmth and care Maria brought to every small corner of his life. It was not sudden, and it did not happen overnight, but the small acts of kindness she offered were planting seeds he did not know he had left in his heart. One morning, Daniel returned from the store carrying supplies. The snow had melted enough to make travel slightly easier, but the paths were still muddy and treacherous. Maria had already prepared breakfast and had firewood stacked neatly for the day. She smiled briefly at him as he entered the cabin, a simple gesture that would have gone unnoticed before, but now felt comforting and genuine. Daniel realized he had been thinking about her smile during his walk down the mountain. a thought that surprised him and made him uncomfortable, even as it warmed his chest. Maria noticed small things about Daniel, too. She saw how he hesitated before answering certain questions, how he would frown slightly when he thought no one was looking, and how he moved quietly, as if carrying a heavy weight inside him. She knew he had been through pain, but she also knew that a person could heal slowly if given patience and understanding. She never pressured him to speak or change. She simply listened when he chose to share, and offered quiet support through her actions. One afternoon, while Daniel was repairing a broken fence near the edge of the property, he slipped on a patch of wet soil and twisted his ankle. He tried to stand, but the pain made him stumble back toward the cabin. Maria saw him immediately and rushed to help. She supported him as he hobbled inside, removed his boots carefully, and prepared a warm cloth to reduce the swelling. She stayed by his side, helping him rest, bringing him food and tea, and checking on him through the day. Daniel, who had always prided himself on his independence, felt frustrated at first. He hated the idea of needing help, hated feeling weak. But as he watched Maria move quietly around the cabin, caring for him without complaint or judgment, he began to see her not just as someone who helped with chores, but as a person with a heart full of patience, understanding, and quiet strength. After a few days of rest, Daniel finally began to speak more openly. He told Maria small stories from his past, about the town he had lived in, the work he had done, and the family he had lost. He did not speak of the accident at first, only of ordinary events, but even these stories revealed a part of him that he had long hidden. Maria listened quietly, never interrupting, never judging, simply letting him speak at his own pace. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the mountains, Daniel sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Maria brought him a simple dinner and sat across from him. For the first time, Daniel spoke about the accident that had changed his life forever. His voice was low, full of emotion he rarely allowed himself to express. He told her about the day his wife and son had died, how he had felt the world crumble around him, and how he had retreated into the mountains to escape the pain. Maria listened without saying a word. When he finished, she finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. "Pain closes the heart," she said, "but kindness can open it again. You are not as lost as you think." Daniel looked at her, surprised. Her words were simple, but they carried a truth he had not heard in years. He realized that she believed in him, not just as a man who could survive in the mountains, but as a person who could heal and care again. Over the next few weeks, their bond grew stronger. Daniel began to notice how Maria's presence changed the atmosphere of the cabin. It was warmer, cleaner, and more organized. Meals were prepared with care, and she often left small notes reminding him of supplies or simple thoughts of encouragement. He found himself smiling quietly when he read them, a feeling he had not experienced in years. Maria also began to share more of her life. She spoke of the convent, the people she had cared for, and the lessons she had learned about patience, service, and the importance of small acts of kindness. Daniel listened with interest, fascinated by how much she had experienced despite her young age. He realized that her strength did not come from physical power or harshness, but from her heart, something he had almost forgotten existed. One day, while Daniel was cutting firewood, he accidentally dropped an axe and injured his hand. The cut was deep enough to need attention, and he could not continue work without help. Maria quickly cleaned the wound, bandaged it, and stayed with him until the pain subsided. Daniel could not hide his gratitude this time. "I don't know what I would do without you," he admitted, his voice softer than usual. Maria smiled gently. "We take care of each other here," she replied. Their daily routines began to include small conversations. They would speak about the weather, the animals they saw outside, or the work that needed to be done. At first, these conversations were simple, almost casual. But over time, Daniel found himself looking forward to them. He realized that speaking with someone who listened, understood, and cared was something he had been missing for many years. The first time Daniel laughed in front of Maria without trying to hide it was a small but meaningful moment. They were fixing a small leak in the roof, and a sudden gust of wind blew their tools around. Maria laughed at the situation, and Daniel found himself joining in. The sound of his own laughter startled him at first, but it felt light, freeing, and healing. He noticed how her smile could lift the weight from his chest, even for a few minutes. Through these shared experiences, Daniel began to see Maria not just as a helper, but as someone who could touch his heart in ways he had long forgotten. Her patience, kindness, and courage made him feel safe, understood, and less alone. And Maria, who had arrived at the mountains seeking only survival, began to see the layers beneath Daniel's rough exterior, the grief, the pain, and the humanity that had been hidden under years of solitude. Their connection was not sudden, and it was not dramatic. It grew slowly, day by day, through shared work, shared meals, and shared moments of care. They learned each other's routines, understood each other's habits, and anticipated each other's needs without words. It was a quiet bond, built on trust, respect, and the unspoken understanding that they were no longer alone in the world. One particularly harsh day, when a snowstorm blocked the mountain paths and trapped them in the cabin, Daniel and Maria worked together to keep the fire going and the supplies organized. They spoke little, relying on gestures and shared understanding. But in those moments of silence, Daniel realized how much he valued her presence. He did not need her only for help. He needed her for the warmth and care that made the cabin feel like home. As spring approached, the ice on the streams melted and the first buds appeared on the trees. Daniel found himself noticing small things about Maria, the way she tended the garden, the way she arranged the firewood, the gentle way she spoke to the animals that wandered near the cabin. These small acts, once invisible, now carried meaning. They were reminders that kindness and care could exist even in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. By the end of this season, Daniel knew that his life had changed in ways he could not fully explain. The cabin, once a place of survival and isolation, had become a space of trust, understanding, and quiet companionship. Maria had not only helped him with daily tasks, but had begun to heal the loneliness that had defined his life for years. He did not yet know if he could fully open his heart, but he felt the first stirrings of hope. For the first time in a long time, he imagined a future where he could trust someone completely, where he could share his life with another person without fear or hesitation. And Maria, who had come to the mountains out of necessity, had discovered that even in the most isolated and challenging circumstances, it was possible to find connection, trust, and the beginnings of love. By working together, caring for each other, and sharing quiet moments of understanding, Daniel and Maria had begun to create something extraordinary. It was not dramatic or loud, but it was real, lasting, and deeply meaningful. The mountains, which had once seemed lonely and harsh, now held a new kind of life, one filled with warmth, hope, and the quiet growth of two hearts slowly opening to one another. Winter returned to the mountains with a sudden, fierce strength. The sky grew heavy with dark clouds, and a cold wind swept down the slopes, rattling the cabin and freezing the streams. Snow piled up quickly, covering the paths that connected the cabin to the nearest settlement. Traveling became impossible, and Daniel realized that they were effectively trapped for several days. He had lived through harsh winters before, but this one felt different. It was heavier, deeper, more demanding. Maria, who had learned the ways of mountain life in the months she had lived there, moved calmly around the cabin. She stacked firewood, checked the supplies, and prepared meals that would last longer than usual. The wind howled outside, and the snow hammered against the roof, but inside, The cabin felt warm and alive. Daniel observed her quietly. He had faced storms before, had survived alone in the wilderness, but he had never experienced a winter where he felt both physically and emotionally supported by someone else. The days of the storm passed slowly. With the cabin sealed against the snow and the fire keeping them warm, there was little to do except tend the basics and wait. This forced Daniel and Maria to spend more time together than they ever had. At first, they spoke in short sentences, exchanging only what was necessary about food, fire, or supplies. But as the hours stretched into long evenings and quiet nights, conversation began to grow. Daniel, who had always been reserved and careful with his words, started sharing more about his life than he had in years. He told Maria stories of his childhood, his early work in the town, and the simple joys he once took for granted. Maria listened with patience and gentle interest. She did not interrupt or judge. She simply let him speak and acknowledged his feelings with small nods or quiet words of understanding. One night, as the snowstorm raged outside, Daniel shared the story he had avoided for so long, the accident that had taken his wife and child. His voice was low, trembling at times, and his eyes reflected the pain he had carried for years. Maria did not respond immediately. She waited until he finished, then spoke softly. "The world can take so much from us," she said, "but it cannot take everything. Your heart is still here. You can still care. You are not lost." Daniel was struck by her words. For years he had believed that showing care, trusting others, or opening his heart was a weakness. Maria's calm voice challenged that belief. It was not a forceful command or judgment. It was simply truth, spoken quietly. For the first time, Daniel began to imagine that perhaps he could allow himself to feel again, to trust again, and even to hope. The snowstorm brought other challenges. One morning, they discovered that some of their food stores had been damaged by moisture, leaving them with less than expected. Daniel felt panic rising, the kind he had not allowed himself to feel in years. But Maria stepped in calmly. She suggested ways to stretch the remaining supplies, cook meals that were filling but simple, and preserve what little was left. Daniel was amazed at how she remained steady under pressure, how she thought clearly and carefully, even when the situation was difficult. Over the next few days, Daniel realized how much he relied on her presence, not just for help, but for strength, calm, and reassurance. He began to notice other small qualities he had overlooked before. The way she moved quietly through the cabin, the care with which she handled each task, the patience she showed even when things were difficult. These were not dramatic acts, but they mattered deeply in the context of survival and trust. One evening, Daniel became frustrated while trying to repair a broken section of the roof. The wind howled, snow blew through a small gap, and the work seemed impossible. Maria came to help, not by taking over, but by offering gentle guidance and support. "You can do this," she said softly, "step by step, one piece at a time." Her words were simple, but they carried encouragement in a way Daniel had not felt in years. Together they worked until the gap was fixed, and for the first time, Daniel realized that he did not have to face challenges alone. The snowstorm forced them to face more than just physical obstacles. Being trapped together in the cabin created moments of emotional vulnerability. Daniel found himself sharing fears he had hidden for years, the fear that he would never heal, the fear that he would always be alone, the fear that the pain of loss had defined him completely. Maria listened patiently, sometimes holding his hand, sometimes sitting quietly, but always offering presence and understanding. One particularly long night, the wind blowing relentlessly against the walls, Daniel admitted to himself something he had not acknowledged before. He was beginning to care deeply for Maria, not just as someone who helped him, but as someone who had touched his heart in ways he thought were impossible. Her kindness, patience, and quiet strength were breaking down the walls he had built around himself. Maria, too, was realizing the depth of her feelings. She had come to the mountains for survival, to have shelter and work, but she had discovered something unexpected, a man who was capable of care, honesty, and courage, even if he had hidden it for years. She saw the grief in his eyes, the careful way he handled tasks, the moments of hesitation before he allowed himself to be vulnerable, and in those moments she recognized the man beneath the mountain exterior, a man capable of love, loyalty, and connection. As the storm began to lessen, Daniel faced a difficult choice. The roads would soon clear, allowing Maria to leave if she wished. He had planned to honor her freedom, offering her support to find a new place in the nearby settlement. Yet the thought of her leaving filled him with an unfamiliar emptiness. He realized that he did not want her to leave, not because he needed help with the cabin, but because he had come to value her presence, her heart, and her understanding more than he had expected. When the snow finally began to melt and the mountain paths became passable again, Daniel approached Maria carefully. He explained that she was free to leave, that he would help her find a safe place and support her if needed. His words were honest, and his voice carried the weight of responsibility and respect. Maria listened, her expression calm but thoughtful. She could have left, she had every right, but she surprised Daniel by saying that she wished to stay. Her decision was not based on necessity. She had learned to survive in the mountains and could have found shelter elsewhere. She stayed because she had come to care for Daniel and believed in the goodness that remained inside him. She saw the potential for trust, warmth, and companionship, and she chose to nurture it alongside him. In the days that followed, their relationship began to shift in small but meaningful ways. They still worked together, still shared meals, and still tended the cabin, but there was a new understanding between them. Daniel no longer tried to hide his feelings completely. He allowed himself small gestures of care, small words of encouragement, and even moments of laughter. Maria continued her gentle, patient ways, but she also began to show subtle signs of affection and trust, creating a quiet bond that grew stronger each day. The storm had tested them, forced them to rely on one another, and revealed the depth of their character. It had shown Daniel that he was capable of connection, trust, and even love again. It had shown Maria that patience, care, and understanding could reach a guarded heart and help it heal. The mountains, which had once seemed harsh and isolating, now became a place where two people discovered not just survival, but hope, trust, and the beginning of a shared life. By the time the last snow melted and the first buds of spring appeared, Daniel and Maria had changed profoundly. They were no longer simply mountain man and helper. They were companions, partners in survival, and slowly two hearts learning to open to one another. The storm had tested them physically, mentally, and emotionally, but it had also created the conditions for a deeper connection, one built on respect, trust, and the quiet recognition of what each had to offer the other. In the stillness of the mountains, amid melting snow and budding trees, Daniel realized something he had not expected. He had come to care for Maria, not because he needed help, but because she had become an essential part of his life. And Maria, too, understood that her presence had become more than a means of survival. She had become part of the life of a man who had once believed he could never care again. The storm had passed, but its effects remained. It had broken down walls, healed old wounds, and created a space where trust, compassion, and affection could flourish. Daniel and Maria were no longer alone. They had found in each other not just companionship, but the quiet beginnings of love that was patient, steady, and real. And in the mountains that had once seemed cold and unforgiving, life now held warmth, hope, and the promise of a future built together. Spring had fully arrived in the mountains, painting the valley with fresh green leaves, colorful wildflowers, and the gentle rush of melted snow in the streams. The long winter was over, and the cabin that had once been quiet, cold, and isolated now felt alive. Inside, Daniel and Maria moved with ease, their routines still practical but touched with a warmth that had grown steadily over the months. The fire burned brighter, the meals were prepared with care, and the cabin no longer felt like a place for survival. It felt like a home. Daniel had changed in ways he did not fully recognize at first. The man who had arrived in the mountains years earlier, bitter, lonely, and guarded, now spoke more, smiled more often, and even laughed at times without hiding it. His interactions with Maria had taught him something he had long forgotten, that kindness could heal, that trust could open a heart, and that human connection was not a weakness, but a source of strength. Maria, too, had grown. She had come to the mountains expecting only survival and shelter, but she found something much deeper, a partnership, respect, and a quiet love that had developed slowly, naturally, and honestly. She had learned that true care is shown not in grand gestures, but in steady attention, patience, and the willingness to be present. She had seen Daniel's heart hidden behind years of pain, and she had chosen to stay, to nurture the possibility of life and connection together. The first days of spring brought new challenges, but also new opportunities. With the snow gone, Daniel and Maria could finally venture down the mountain together to trade goods, check the village, and meet neighbors. These trips became occasions not just for practical purposes, but also for connection. People in the nearby settlements noticed the change in Daniel. The once cold and distant mountain man now walked with a quiet confidence, a softer expression, and a willingness to speak with others. Maria's calm presence had rubbed off on him, teaching him patience, empathy, and understanding. One afternoon, as they walked down a forested trail together, they came across a young family whose wagon had broken. The family looked worried, and the children were cold and hungry. Daniel instinctively reached for his tools to fix the wagon, but Maria quietly guided him. "Let's see how we can help first," she said softly. Together they repaired the wagon and offered the family some of their supplies. Watching Maria interact with the children, Daniel realized that she was the heart of everything they did. Her kindness inspired him to act not just out of duty, but from a place of genuine care. Back at the cabin, the days continued with simple work, tending the small garden Maria had started, chopping wood, repairing fences, and preparing meals. But now, even ordinary tasks carried a sense of joy and shared purpose. Daniel would often catch himself watching Maria as she worked, noticing the focus in her eyes, the grace in her movements, and the quiet strength that seemed to guide everything she did. He began to understand that the connection they shared was not just emotional. It was a partnership, a balance of strength and heart, effort and care. One evening, after a long day of work, Daniel sat by the fire, his thoughts heavy yet calm. He realized that he had been wrong in the past to believe that life could not be meaningful again. The mountains, which had once seemed only harsh and lonely, had become a place of growth, learning, and love. He turned to Maria, who was arranging supplies nearby, and said softly, "I never thought I could feel this way again. You've changed everything." Maria smiled, not with arrogance or pride, but with a quiet acknowledgement that she had been part of something meaningful. "We've changed each other," she said. "The mountains tested us, but they also taught us how to care." Her words struck Daniel deeply. It was not a declaration of romance in the dramatic sense, but a truth he felt in his bones. She had helped him find his heart again, and he realized that he had begun to care for her in a way that went beyond simple gratitude. As the days passed, the bond between them grew stronger. They shared more personal stories, more moments of laughter, and even small disagreements, but always with respect and understanding. Daniel discovered that he could trust Maria completely, not just with practical matters, but with his feelings, fears, and hopes for the future. Maria, in turn, saw that Daniel was capable of love and care, and that beneath his rugged exterior was a man whose heart had endured loss but could still grow, expand, and heal. The local community began to notice the transformation as well. Daniel, once the solitary mountain man, became someone who quietly helped travelers, offered guidance to neighbors, and shared resources when needed. Maria continued her work, assisting not only Daniel but also those who came to them for help. Together, they created a life that was practical, compassionate, and grounded in shared effort and mutual respect. People who encountered them often remarked on the quiet strength of their partnership and the warmth that radiated from the small cabin on the mountainside. One day Daniel and Maria walked to a nearby meadow, a place where the snow had melted and the wildflowers were beginning to bloom. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sunlight play across the landscape. Daniel reached for Maria's hand, a gesture that carried meaning beyond words. It was a connection built on trust, shared hardship, and deep understanding. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to feel fully present in the moment, without fear, regret, or worry. Maria squeezed his hand gently. "This is what it means to be alive," she said. "Not just surviving, but truly living, with someone you trust and care for." Daniel nodded, understanding that her words reflected the life they had built together, one born not of chance or convenience, but of choice, patience, and care. Over time, the cabin became more than a home. It became a symbol of resilience, growth, and love. Daniel and Maria continued their routines, but they also began to dream about the future. They spoke of expanding the small garden, building a better shelter for the animals, and perhaps even helping more travelers who came their way. These plans were modest, practical, and deeply personal, but they reflected a new sense of purpose that had grown in both of them. One evening, as the sun set and the sky glowed with shades of pink and gold, Daniel reflected on his journey. He had come to the mountains to escape pain and isolation, seeking only solitude and survival. He had expected the work, the cold, and the silence, but he had not expected to find a heart like Maria's, someone whose care and presence could awaken feelings he thought were lost forever. Maria, too, reflected on her journey. She had come seeking shelter and safety, prepared for hardship and loneliness, but she had discovered a man capable of love, kindness, and partnership. She had seen him at his weakest, at his most guarded, and had chosen to stay. Her decision had not been easy, but it had been true to her heart. Together they had built a life that neither could have imagined alone, a life of warmth, respect, and quiet love. As spring turned into summer, the mountains were alive with growth and life. Daniel and Maria worked side by side, their routines filled with purpose, their hearts filled with connection. They laughed, shared meals, tended the cabin, and helped those who came their way. The bond that had begun in necessity had grown into something profound, a partnership of strength, care, and mutual understanding. Years later, the story of Daniel and Maria became a quiet legend among the nearby settlements. People spoke of the mountain man who had once been cold and distant, and the young woman who had brought warmth, patience, and kindness into his life. They spoke of a cabin that was not just a place to survive, but a home where two hearts had grown together, slowly, steadily, and deeply. Daniel often reflected on the truth he had learned. He had thought he needed help to survive the mountains, but what he truly needed was someone who could help him rebuild his heart. Maria, who had arrived expecting only shelter, discovered that love and partnership could grow even in the harshest conditions. Together they had not only survived, but they had thrived, building a life that was rich in trust, care, and quiet happiness. In the stillness of the mountains, with the fire burning in the cabin and the wind rustling the trees outside, Daniel and Maria knew something important. Life could be hard, and loss could leave deep scars, but with patience, trust, and kindness, hearts could heal, bonds could grow, and love could flourish, even in the most unexpected places. And so, the mountain man and the young woman who had once come for survival found something far greater than shelter or work. They found each other. They found trust, understanding, and the quiet, steady love that carried them through storms, winters, and every challenge the mountains could offer. The cabin, once a place of solitude, had become a home. And in that home, two hearts, once broken and guarded, had learned to beat together again.